One of the biggest contributors to climate change comes from the vehicles we drive every day. Fossil fuels such as petroleum are used to produce gasoline, a carbon-emitting fuel. In 2020, transportation made up about 27% of the total carbon dioxide emissions. To combat this massive contributor to global warming, an alternative type of fuel has been testing the waters for almost 2 decades: biofuel. Biofuel is made from biological materials and can be harvested from plants, animals, and microorganisms. But out of these sources, the most efficient way to produce biofuel is by far crops. Crops such as corn, for example, is one that can be harvested to produce ethanol, an alcohol that can be used as a fuel source to run cars. But chemists and people familiar with the structure of ethanol may be skeptical about this process. Since both ethanol and gasoline have the same ingredients required to produce carbon dioxide, wouldn't the burning of ethanol be just as bad as using standard fossil fuels? Well, although they produce the same amount of CO2 as regular gasoline, the sustainability of the process lies within the production cycle. Whereas fossil fuels are emitted into the atmosphere, the process of renewing those fuel sources takes millions of years. But crops can be grown and harvested in only a few months, during which they will absorb relatively the same amount of CO2 from the atmosphere that burning ethanol emits, which they will use as an energy source. So theoretically, if the same amount of crops were being grown, harvested, and turned into ethanol through each cycle, then the system would be in equilibrium and no extra carbon would be added to the Earth's climate. The idea behind biofuels appealed to Congress, which is understandable. On paper, it seems like a great alternative to fossil fuels. It would cycle the emitted carbon back into crops and result in a sustainable system. They were so confident in the idea that in 2005 they authorized the Renewable Fuel Standard, the RFS, which would be overseen by the EPA. Their goal was to mix 36 billion gallons of biofuel into regular, non-renewable fuel by 2022. To do this, they required that a certain amount of biofuel be blended into gasoline and diesel each year. Their plan was to use corn production as their main source of ethanol, expanding the corn industry and subsidizing production. Ethanol would then be mixed into gasoline and sold as usual. To make sure all entities in the process would play ball, the EPA introduced a credit known as a Renewable Identification Number, an RIN. When biofuel is blended into petroleum, the resulting batch of marketable gas is assigned an RIN. This acted as proof of compliance with the RFS and could be bought and sold amongst players in the industry. This policy is still in effect today, and you can see the evidence at most gas stations. 10% ethanol, 10% corn. This 10% is just a start, however. The EPA plans to gradually increase the percent ethanol in gasoline up to 20%, double what it is now. So now we must answer the question: has this policy been working? Well, there are some advantages to the system that have been beneficial. The system is more renewable than using strictly fossil fuels because it recycles most of the CO2 it emits. That is definitely a plus. And even if the carbon sequestration isn't 100% equal with its emissions, I would argue that it's still much better than using strictly fossil fuels. But on top of the environmental benefits, there are also social and economic benefits that can be exhibited, which include the thousands of jobs that it provides to Americans. There are many important roles that all need to be filled by workers in this process, from harvesting corn on farms to mixing ethanol in refineries. Jobs like these wouldn't be as abundant without this policy in place. But despite those benefits, there are many unintended consequences that outweigh them. Although on paper biofuel seems like a perfectly sustainable solution, it comes at a price. The amount of land required to produce a high enough amount of ethanol is too great to sustain. About 8% of US land is already being used to produce the ethanol we mix into gas. The EPA's plan to one day double the 10% ethanol in gasoline to 20% would mean doubling that farmland. Having around 16% of our land dedicated to just the production of ethanol would mean that many other production services would be diminished. Another problem lies with the production process itself. Although it is true that carbon-wise it is for the most part sustainable, when it comes to the resource side of things, not so much. The amount of water that is required to grow the amount of corn being asked is ultimately unsustainable given our current circumstances. On top of that issue, there's also the issue of extracting ethanol from corn, transporting it, and mixing it in gasoline, all of which require energy. So before ethanol can even get from the inside of corn to people's gas tanks, carbon is being emitted. The final major issue with biofuel has to do with the economy. About 95% of the US feed grain comes from corn. It is used to feed many of the animals whose meats and byproducts we consume every day. But since the introduction of the renewable fuel standard, 40.5% of corn production has become dedicated to ethanol. Taking away almost half the feed grain from consumers, animal farmers, and other entities causes the price of their produce to increase. For example, less corn being sold on the market means more expensive food to feed chickens. Less food to feed chickens leads to less chickens, and less chickens leads to more expensive eggs. This chain reaction can be traced to other farmed grocery items, but a more direct consequence has to do with the gas economy. The introduction of RINs as a required mark of compliance resulted in unintended consequences in the market. Companies who can afford to blend their own gas don't have to purchase RINs from refineries, giving them a big advantage in the market. Of course, the only ones who have these capabilities are big corporations with money. This leaves the small businesses behind, forcing them to purchase RINs from the big corporations and refineries if they want to stay alive. In theory, biofuel is a great alternative to fossil fuel. But given the many disadvantages and consequences that result from the renewable fuel standard, it's fair to say that implementing biofuel through this system is not sustainable. The ultimate solution is to move away from fuel in general. Electric cars don't require fuel and don't emit any greenhouse gas. Biofuel is good at delaying the effects of climate change, but eventually we will need a system that reverses it.